Hi, my name is Ethan. I am an educator for the Cheehaw Park and Zoo, the Flint River Aquarium, and the Thronatisca Heritage Center here in Albany, Georgia. And today I'm going to talk to you guys about, sorry, radio. I'm going to tell you guys about macroinvertebrates today, specifically aquatic macroinvertebrates. So let's go ahead and get started. So, aquatic macroinvertebrates. Whenever I say aquatic macroinvertebrates, it might be it's kind of a mouthful, right? So let's break that down into its base components here. So um, aquatic obviously means water, So these are water macroinvertebrates. So what does macroinvertebrate means? Well, let's skip over macro for a minute and let's talk about invertebrate. So there are two very large groups of animals, invertebrates and vertebrates. So invertebrates have no backbone, and vertebrates have a backbone. So we are an example of a vertebrate, whereas other things like, say, insects are an example of an invertebrate. So they don't have backbones, we do. So they are aquatic, they're related to water and they don't have a backbone. So what does macro mean? Well, macro in this case means anything large enough to be seen with the naked eye. So it's a microinvertebrate would be something so small, a tiny little creature so small that we couldn't see it. We need a microscope or a magnifying glass or something to enhance our ability to see these creatures. But macro means they're large enough to see with the naked eye. So aquatic macroinvertebrate, put it all together, they are a water-dwelling creature that doesn't have a spine that is large enough for us to see. So why on earth are we talking about macroinvertebrates? Why are we studying them? Why are we learning about them? Because many of these water-dwelling insects, many insects and other creatures spend their juvenile years in water. So a lot of insects start their lifetime in water, and then a lot of them will actually develop wings and then learn to fly. A lot of creatures rely on water. And so these to give birth and to begin their life stage. So they are important because they're born in the water. They serve as a backbone for the aquatic habitats that they live in too. So bugs and other insects and things like that that live in the water get eaten by a lot of other different creatures. They eat each other. There's this extremely complex food web that's going on between them, and they serve as sort of the backbone of the habitat. If you didn't have these aquatic macroinvertebrates all over the place, then you simply would not be able to have a functional habitat. So let's say that you're out at a pond, and the pond normally is filled with bugs and insects and things, but let's say that you cut down all the trees around the pond. Now suddenly these trees aren't dropping leaves into the edges of the water. Nothing's going to be living there. All of these insects die, or at least most of them do, and suddenly all of the other creatures are going to die as well. If the insects die off, then the small lizards and fish are going to die off. And then if those ones die off, then the larger fish and turtles and amphibians are going to die off. And then if those die off, then the even larger things like hawks and birds and things are going to die off. So all of them, they serve as this sort of keystone that without them, everything would fall apart. Another reason why macroinvertebrates are important to study is because they indicate quality of water. So we can actually use macroinvertebrates to tell us how clean our bodies of water are. So you can actually determine the health of a stream or a pond or anything like that simply by studying the creatures that are living in it. So I just mentioned that they can be used to sort of tell the health of a stream. Different species can tolerate different levels of pollution. Um, in the case of macroinvertebrates, you can actually tell how clean a stream is based on what you find. So it's actually really fun to do. You don't even need to be like a hardcore scientist to do this. You can just go out, catch a few cool critters in your nearby stream or pond, and tell how clean it is. So um, the more sensitive a species is, the less likely it is to survive in polluted water. So on all the way on the needs to be super clean end, you get animals like stoneflies. Um, and then there's a gradient to how much creatures can tolerate from there on in. Um, from stoneflies, you get dragonflies, and from dragonflies, you get other things. Um, and it moves on and it moves on all the way up until only the most tolerant species can really survive in heavily polluted waters. And then if the pollution level is even extreme enough, nothing's going to be able to survive. So it's extremely important that we preserve things. Now that isn't to say, it says like tubifex worm can survive in high levels of pollution. That doesn't necessarily mean that a tubifex worm is only going to live in high levels of pollution. It's going to live in all of these. And this guy, a hoglouse, is going to live in all of the ones with less pollution. Freshwater shrimps might live in all of these. So the cleaner your stream, the more species you're going to have within it. And the more species you have, that's generally a sign of a very healthy ecosystem. If you only have like 3 different creatures living in a space, it's not a very healthy ecosystem. There's not a lot of life there. But if you have, 20 or 30 or 50 or however many you want living all in one space, that means that that ecosystem is thriving. It's very healthy. There's a lot going on. So we use these macroinvertebrates. The more sensitive species that we find indicates to us the health of our stream. So let's talk a little bit about these macroinvertebrates. So let's start by describing sensitive species. So as I mentioned a minute ago, sensitive species are the ones that require very, very, very little pollution. They really can only survive in a very, very specific sort of environment. So these guys, whenever we're talking about aquatic macroinvertebrates, are creatures that can only live in very clean water. And I gave 2 examples here, stoneflies, which are these dudes on the bottom, and mayflies, which are these guys on the top. Now, uh, they look very similar, especially in the water. I want you to picture for just a minute. I want you to, sorry, I just exited out of the screen here. I want you to picture for just a minute how big these guys really would be. They're absolutely tiny. They might get as big as, say, an inch or 2 inches large. So even though we said macroinvertebrates, as in large invertebrates, they're really not that big. Stoneflies are easy to tell because they've got 2 little tails sticking out of them, and mayflies have 3 tails sticking out of them, which is the way that you can usually tell that they are mayflies versus stoneflies. They tend to live in similar areas. Stoneflies will cling to rocks and munch on any dead animal material that's going by. So they'll catch like very, very small bugs and zooplankton, which are microinvertebrates. They're very, very small little animals. Mayflies will do pretty much the same. They eat more plant material than stoneflies do, but they both can only tolerate a very, very small amount of pollution, if any at all. So it's very important to keep them, to keep our water streams healthy, because otherwise these animals simply will not exist. They will just die off. And actually, Both of these are nymphs. They undergo incomplete metamorphosis, which we'll talk about a little bit more here later. But both of these guys, whenever they grow up, will grow up um, to develop wings. In fact, actually, this image of the mayfly, you can actually already see some very, very small wings forming right there on it. Um, and they will both develop wings and fly around. And actually, the stonefly, it's very interesting. They will live for a whole year, um, or even longer as a nymph, as a juvenile, like a baby, and then they will sprout their wings and shed out of their baby skin and fly away. And for 24 hours, they will be alive and they will mate and they will lay eggs and then they will die. So they spend almost no time in their adult form. It's really, really special to be able to see them in their adult form, actually. So after sensitive species, you get what's known as facultative species. These guys can tolerate some amounts of pollution, but not a whole lot. So they can't do a whole lot with their pollution, but they can survive more than say a sensitive species might be able to. So they um, they can tolerate a little bit of pollution, but not a ton. These guys are usually found in more places than say a sensitive species might be, but they tend to live in things like ponds and slow-moving water systems, which tend to gather a little bit more pollution than say a stream. Um, and they also are uh, kind of wild looking, I think. So I've got a couple examples of uh, of creatures here. Up here in the corner, we have a damselfly, and they're actually very closely related to dragonflies, which is this guy down here in the corner. Damselflies and dragonflies both grow up, and you've probably seen a dragonfly before. A damselfly looks very similar to a dragonfly in their adult stage, but they're usually a little bit more slender and they fold their wings upright instead of laying their wings out flat like a dragonfly does. Um, and then other examples of facultative species are things like Helgermites or Dobsonfly nymphs. They're sometimes called Helgermites as well. And these guys try to make themselves look really dangerous and scary um, by getting all of these little spikes. The spikes are totally harmless. They're not actually hard spikes. These things are kind of like worms. Um, and so they've really only got these 3 front legs, and then they pretend to have many more legs to make other creatures intimidated by them. That's also why they have these big jaws. They're actually for cutting plant material. These guys are herbivores. They will eat plants till their adult life. I think they might be carnivorous in their adult life, but as children, they mainly eat plants and dead plant material. Um, uh, Down here is a caddisfly nymph. So usually you don't see caddisfly nymphs just by themselves. They will usually be in their casing. So what they do is they use this highly uh, sticky spit. They literally just have very sticky spit, and they will spit onto anything that they grab nearby. So like small pebbles, sticks, things like that that are floating by leaf material, and they'll spit on it, and then they will just stick it together until they have themselves a little home like this. And then they will stay latched on to things like rocks. So if you go out and you pick up a rock from a stream and you see that it's got a little something sticking to it, it's not just that thing sticking to it. It's usually a dob or a caddisfly as well. A caddisfly is usually attached to it. So that's what you're finding whenever you're out there in streams and such. Um, so these guys, like I said, can tolerate some pollution, but not a lot. These are examples of creatures that, in their ideal situation live in very specific places with not a lot of pollution, but then if something changes in their environment, they do a little bit better job um, surviving it than, say, a sensitive species. So these guys can do a little bit more. So if you find these guys in your water, but you don't find any sensitive species in your water, then you know that your water is somewhat dirty, but not super dirty. And then finally, you get what's known as tolerant species. So tolerant species, they can tolerate nearly any water condition. Some examples of them are things like leeches. These are bloodworms, also sometimes called midges. This guy up here is a mosquito larva. It looks very weird because I don't think you've ever probably seen a mosquito larva that close before. So these guys, they can tolerate almost any water condition. So if you are in a stream and you only find mosquito larvae and midge larvae and leeches and tubifex worms, which are on that list here that I showed before, if you find only those creatures, then you know that your water is polluted. If you find these creatures, but then you also find things like caddisflies and you also find mayflies and stoneflies, then you know that your stream is actually very clean and very healthy, because a healthy ecosystem has a whole bunch of everything, not just one specific kind of creature. Both mosquitoes and midges are larvae, not nymphs. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but they undergo complete metamorphosis. So they will go from a larva to a pupa to an adult. Things like leeches are parasites. They suck blood, and they can live virtually anywhere. They live almost everywhere in almost all kinds of water. Most of them are perfectly harmless. In fact, there's not a single one in North America that spreads disease. You have to go down to places like South America if you want leeches that have the chance to spread disease. So if you end up getting a leech on you in, say, a pond or a stream or something, it's not the end of the world. It's okay. It happens. I've had leeches on me before. They are not super harmful. I mean, they're not good for you. They're going to drink your blood, but they don't do much else. So it's not the worst thing in the world. Now, these guys, as I mentioned, are tolerant species. They can survive almost any water condition. Actually, I've seen like mosquito larvae growing in like an old tire that now has water inside of it. You know, mosquitoes are capable of surviving just about anywhere. As long as like the water doesn't freeze over on them whenever they're breeding, they can pretty much live absolutely anywhere. And you'll actually find mosquitoes all the way up in the subarctic, all the way down to the Antarctic. There are mosquitoes almost everywhere on this planet, which just says something about tolerant species. Tolerant species can survive a very wide range of conditions. They don't really care what the health of the stream is. They can survive in it. So let's talk about nymphs versus larvae. So insects undergo what's known as metamorphosis. They start as some sort of juvenile, some sort of child, once they hatch from their egg, and then egg goes to child, child turns into an adult somehow, and there's different processes that they go through. There are two broad processes. One is called complete metamorphosis, and one is called incomplete metamorphosis. And so if I mention a nymph, that is the juvenile form of a creature that undergoes incomplete metamorphosis, and a larva undergoes complete metamorphosis. So nymphs usually look like smaller versions of the adult. So this stonefly nymph, with the exception of the fact that it is missing wings, looks pretty much like an adult stonefly. It'll get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it eventually will shed out of its last layer of child skin to form, and it will have wings and those wings will unfurl, but it will still pretty much look like the same animal. Other creatures, like the mosquito, look completely different as a larva and then have to go through a pupal stage to become an adult. And so let's talk about life stages for aquatic macroinvertebrates for a minute. So as I mentioned, incomplete metamorphosis. Let's talk about this for a little bit here. This is the life cycle of a dragonfly. So what happens is they will start out, an adult dragonfly will lay an egg. I noticed that these arrows are backwards. These arrows are backwards. Don't pay attention to these arrows. It's supposed to be going the other way. But an adult will lay an egg, or a couple eggs, usually a lot of eggs, and then those eggs will hatch and become dragonfly nymphs, which we had a better photo of right here. And you can actually kind of see, now that I've said that it's a dragonfly nymph, you can kind of see the dragonfly characteristics to it, right? Like it's got the big eyes on its head, it's got the 3 legs on each side, and it's got the slightly larger butt, or thorax if you want to get technical. They will turn into an early nymph, and then what will happen is these nymphs will just keep shedding and shedding and shedding, and every single iteration, every single time they shed their outer shell, they will look a little bit more like an adult until finally they shed and become an adult. So a great example of incomplete metamorphosis is actually cicadas. If you've ever seen cicadas, that what they do is they spend a bunch of years under the ground, and then whenever they come out from under the ground, they crawl up a tree, shed out of their juvenile form into their adult life, and then go mate, lay eggs, and die. So a dragonfly nymph and any other kind of nymph, they don't go through a pupal stage. They don't have a cocoon or anything like that. They just keep shedding layers until they become an adult. And so let's compare that to complete metamorphosis here, where you start out as an egg and then you become a larva instead of a nymph. And larvas usually don't look a whole lot like adults. In fact, usually they're very worm-like. So in this case, this is a monarch caterpillar. It goes from an egg to a larval stage, and then it will eat and get bigger and grow until it becomes large enough that it forms a pupa stage. So in the case of butterflies, it forms what's known as a chrysalis, which is made out of a bunch of vomit. Essentially, they use their barf and make this cocoon shell, and then they will hatch from it after undergoing some significant metamorphosis. Literally, their entire body will turn into goo and then rearrange itself as an adult. In this case, an adult butterfly, but other creatures like the mosquito, they start out as this larva here, and then they become a mosquito pupa, and then whenever they hatch out of their pupal stage, they come out as a full-blown adult. It's kind of like a second egg. So you get an egg turning into a larva, and then a larva has to essentially make a brand new egg in the form of a cocoon or a chrysalis, and then will turn into an adult. So it's kind of incredible. So that's true for all macroinvertebrates here. These macroinvertebrates will undergo a form of metamorphosis. Sometimes that form of metamorphosis is very simple. They just get bigger and bigger and bigger. If you look at things like crayfish, for instance, which are a macroinvertebrate, they don't have a backbone, and they're somewhat large. Crayfish or crawfish or crawdads or whatever you want to call them will start out as a very, very small creature, and then over their entire lifetime will just keep shedding old layers of skin to become the larger crayfish that we know today. insects like mayflies and damselflies and dragonflies and stoneflies will undergo metamorphosis by just slowly, every time that they shed, sort of become this larger version of their juvenile stage, and then will eventually become an adult. So that was my talk on macroinvertebrates for you. So let's just do a little bit of summary for review here. Macroinvertebrate means any creature that does not have a backbone that is large enough to see. And so whenever we are talking about aquatic macroinvertebrates, we are usually referring to insects and things like that that live in and around the water. Different sensitivities can indicate different things, and you can actually tell the health of your own stream by looking at sensitivity. So I encourage you to go find yourself a little pond or a stream and look around for bugs, and you can maybe find out how healthy that stream is just by observing those bugs. I hope you have a good day, and thank you for watching. Bye.